There's a theory of human history called the Great Man Theory. It was proposed and promoted in the 1800s by philosopher and historian Thomas Carlyle, who said that history can largely be explained by great men and their influence. I'd amend that to say great men and women, or simply great humans, but this theory wasn't accepted by everyone. Others believed progress and innovation are part of the collective achievement. It's based on environment, social influence, and a slow evolution of stepping stone ideas. I think both are true, and as you heard in my talk with Lawrence Kessenich, I break it down in a slightly different way. Things in human history are inevitable or they're not. Here's a fun example: the boat propeller. I don't know if you think it's fun, but I do, because this is one of those inventions that seems obvious now. Yet it took thousands of years to think up. The boat propeller was only invented in the early 1800s, and really it was adapted from the Egyptian screw that dates back to the 3rd century BC. It took more than 2,000 years to make this leap from an Egyptian screw, which was used to bring up water from a well or river, to the boat propeller. And it took thousands of years between the inventions of the sail and the oar to the invention of the propeller. And I can't help thinking, how would history have been different if Athenian or Carthaginian navies had these propellers on their ships? A fleet with this invention would have run circles around the enemy. Still, the propeller feels inevitable, just a matter of mathematics and physics. Eventually, someone was going to figure it out. But the novel Shoeless Joe and the movie Field of Dreams were not inevitable, not even close. And of course, the men who created them and spurred them on were influenced by society and other people. But if Lawrence Kessenich had not existed, we probably wouldn't have Field of Dreams. Millions of people would not have enjoyed and would not continue to have significant emotional experiences because of this film. And the same is true for Bill Kinsella, otherwise known by his author name, W.P. Kinsella. And what's even more fascinating to me is that of all the people who could have written this story, W.P. Kinsella is one of the least likely.
This book really should have never been written. The film should have never been made.
I sort of have this feeling that one of the reasons I was born, was to be part of this, to get this out into the culture.
What they didn't count on was the word of mouth, that people would see it and then just say, oh my God, you have to go see this movie. It ended up defying the odds.
Midnight Library of Baseball presents Season 2, The Making of Field of Dreams. From unlikely inception to enduring impact across generations. And as always, no loud music or jarring sounds. I'm Ben Orlando. When you read some books and then learn about the author, you often think, oh, they were born to write this story, or their lives led them to inevitably tell this tale. In the case of W.P. Kinsella, he was born and raised not to write Shoeless Joe. If you've never seen a picture of W.P. Kinsella, imagine a 1980s version of Mark Twain. A white handlebar mustache goatee, large, dark 1980s style glasses, a cowboy hat, and manic white hair pouring out from that hat. Looking at Kinsella, you'd either think, this guy has character, or this guy is a character. But a character who could produce. Even though he started publishing his stories later in life, W.P. Kinsella ultimately published 17 short story collections, and 7 novels. He was made an Officer of the Order of Canada, named to the Order of British Columbia, and in 2009, he received the George Woodcock Lifetime Achievement Award. And even though most of Kinsella's novels include some supernatural element, and of course his most famous novel, Shoeless Joe, includes ghosts and time travel, W.P. Kinsella despised religion and the supernatural.
So first, let me address I despise is the perfect word. I mean, despite, like, hated, loathed.
That's Willie Steele.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. I know you have on your university site Willie, so do you go by Willie?
I do, yeah. William is whenever I'm in trouble or I have something legal I have to sign. So yeah, Willie.
Steele is a professor of English at Lipscomb University. He's a baseball historian and author of the book Going the Distance, The Life and Works of W.P. Kinsella. Maybe no one alive outside of Kinsella's children knows more about Kinsella and his many contradictions.
There is not a word strong enough for what he felt about what he called the self-righteous, hypocritical, evangelical Bible thumpers. His father-in-law, Sam, he said, was just a warm, generous, just a beautiful person, just a really, really nice guy. Everything he had good to say about his father-in-law, complete 180 with his mother-in-law. Could hardly stand to be in the same room with her. Almost like looking down her nose at him as one of the unwashed heathen, and she's this pious. And again, I'm getting all of this from Bill Kinsella, so yeah. I recognize that there's probably some middle ground here. But that was what he hated. This kind of self-righteousness, holier than thou sort of attitude, and that comes across.
Another key moment that shaped Kinsella's hatred of the supernatural happened when he was very young, and it was initially an inspiring, uplifting moment. When he was 4 years old, on Christmas Eve, Billy Kinsella pressed his nose against the parlor window as his mother encouraged him to keep his eyes open for Santa Claus. Suddenly, the jolly face with white hair and pink skin appeared on the other side of the glass, and the little boy shouted in glee to his mother, "I saw him! I saw him!" Fast forward some years later, Bill Kinsella was digging in the barn and discovered a tattered papier-mâché Santa Claus mask eaten away by mice. Most children or teenagers making that discovery would be sad, or they'd smile and shake their heads. "Aw, Dad, that was you." But this realization hit Bill Kinsella hard. This was the start of his rupture with the supernatural. And it's important to note that his father was the perpetrator, the betrayer, the liar. And before his death, Bill's father, John Kinsella, betrayed him again. All his life, John Kinsella had been against religion, as had his son, Bill. But when he knew death was near, John Kinsella turned to religion for comfort, and Bill was furious.
I remember reading, he sent me some autobiographical notes that he had written about 1983.
Again, Willie Steele.
And so at this point, Bill is late 40s. And he said, "I'll never forgive my father for being weak and crawling back to the Catholic Church." And so I had called him and we were talking. I said, I read this note and I wonder, and this was probably 2013, 14, 15, somewhere around there. And so several years later, I said, "Have you come to a point where you can forgive your dad?" And he did not hesitate. He goes, "Absolutely not." He said, he was like, and this is his father he's talking about.
Yeah.
And so I figure if he can carry a grudge like that against his father, he has no problem carrying a grudge against a literary critic.
And carry a grudge Bill Kinsella did. And this is another one of those contrasts, because Lawrence Kestenik, after reading Shoeless Joe, said that the characters in the story were, quote, so real, so vulnerable, so good, that they remind us of that side of human which makes living and loving and striving after dreams worth the effort, end quote. And here we have Bill Kinsella exploding or complaining about everyone. He openly criticized academic colleagues. He went on the radio and tore apart reviewers and literary critics. He often referred to students as functionally illiterate. He said of his high school guidance counselor, who dissuaded Kinsella from a career in writing, quote, there is a special place in hell for McCoy, end quote. Complaining and returning criticism for Bill Kinsella was nearly a full-time job.
There were file folders in the archive. Whenever he would write a letter to someone, he would make a copy of it. And so he would write these really angry letters to a critic. Or there was a restaurant one time that wanted to charge him 25 cents for extra cream. And he fired off a letter to the owner of the restaurant, and he copied. I'm like,
wow.
How much could this guy have written if he would have focused that energy towards another book? He could have
written. And he wrote so much.
Yeah.
What is your take on, because and there are stories, his father dressing up as Santa Claus, like these stories that, point to the reasons why he despised the supernatural and, the religion and his relatives, which again pops up in Shoeless Joe and Field of Dreams, right? The in-laws and their background.
Yeah.
But why then did W.P. Kinsella, who despised the supernatural and religion, included how did he see that as a technique or a tool in his writing?
And I asked him, I said, for somebody who is an atheist, and he was a literal card-carrying atheist. I've seen his membership card for the American Atheist Association in the archives. I didn't know they had membership cards.
Yeah, wow.
Like, first of all, what do you do with that? Do you show it you have to flash it at the meetings? I don't know. But this is somebody, and he donated money to the atheist organizations. And I asked him, I said, so how do you, using the Bible seems really awkward. And he says, I've read the Bible. He goes, I don't believe it, but it's a good story. He goes, it has really wonderful, like the flood story is great. So why wouldn't I use that? Why wouldn't I use Gideon? Why wouldn't I use prodigal son? I never thought of it like that, right? Because again, as a Christian myself, I view the Bible differently than he does. He sees it as a really great literary text. And if there's a really great story that you can kind of repurpose and turn into a baseball story, so much the better. But no, he didn't have any reason for him in his head to believe anything in the Bible, but it's still a good story.
For people who know and love Field of Dreams or Shoeless Joe, it feels like, this is a revelation, right? Or a hammer to the head to know this, right? Wow, like how can you do that? And just like religion, the supernatural too. It's like it's a device that fits and can move the story forward.
As a Christian myself, I view the Bible differently than he does. He sees it as a really great literary text. And if there's a really great story that you can kind of repurpose and turn into a baseball story, so much the better.
If you've ever attended a writing class or workshop, one constant, almost guaranteed tip from instructors is to write what you know. Write from your life and experiences. Harness that part of you touched by real events and people. But W.P. Kinsella was a strict opponent of this maxim. He encouraged writers to not get anywhere close to what they know in their writing. He encouraged them to use their imaginations, and he denied falling into what he'd consider a trap in writing.
Well, there's very little autobiographical material in my work.
This is Kinsella from a 1995 interview.
My dad did tell some stories about Joe Jackson. He had played some minor league baseball, so that part was true. That was sort of how the thing came about. I got to thinking about some stories my dad had told me about Joe Jackson and what became of him after the Black Sox scandal, and they were good stories, but not necessarily true stories. And I just thought, what would happen if, which is what authors spend their whole life saying to themselves, what would happen if Shoeless Joe Jackson came back to life in this time and place, which was Iowa City, Iowa, 1978. But other than that, there's not a lot of autobiography in my work.
One of the reasons Kinsella claimed he didn't write autobiography was that his life was just not that interesting. But this is a matter of perspective, isn't it? William Patrick Kinsella was born in Edmonton, Canada in 1935 and lived the first 10 years of his life on a farm miles from anywhere, with just his parents and for a while his aunt. And Billy Kinsella was so unfamiliar with the idea of other children that for a long time he simply thought of himself as a small adult. From the start, Billy Kinsella created fantasies around him, along with imaginary friends, and books were also his companions from a young age, so that when he finally attended school, his reading skills were far ahead of other children. Kinsella wrote stories either on paper or, mostly, in his head. But he experienced his first rush as a writer in 10th grade when he and his classmates read the play The Admirable Crichton by J.M. Barrie, and they were instructed to rewrite a new third act. Well, Bill Kinsella loved the assignment. He earned a 95%, but for him it wasn't about the grade. He later said it was about, quote, the story pouring off my pen and feeling the ideas forming in my mind, end quote. And to pull back for a second from Kinsella, I want to point to a coincidence between Kinsella and myself, or two coincidences. And this phenomenon of coincidence happens over and over again with people linked to Field of Dreams. For instance, the day after I agreed to speak to Lawrence Kesnick, the day I really started to dive into this project from the beginning, happened to be Bill Kinsella's birthday, if he was still alive. And this story about Kinsella's 10th grade writing assignment is amazingly similar to my aha moment as a writer. When I was in 11th grade, our English teacher had us read a short story, but he left out the last few pages. He told us to finish the story, and then we'd read each other's ending along with the actual ending from the author. And the student who received the most votes would win a prize. Well, I ended up getting not only the most votes, but more votes than the actual author. And for the life of me, I can't remember what the story was or who the author was. I do remember I won a CD of Abbey Road by the Beatles. I probably would have liked to have had a girlfriend to give it to. As it turned out, I gave the CD to my mom. But that was the first time I thought, wow, I can write. I can imagine and tell a story that people will really get into. And another similarity here, I didn't really get anywhere with writing for decades. And the same was true for W.P. Kinsella. He struggled trying to make a living, just odd jobs here and there, trying to figure out what he wanted to do while still trying to be a writer. In his 30s, he owned a restaurant and saw some success, so he finally had time to write. And his first stories had nothing to do with baseball. He wrote about the natives of Canada, local tribes, and their struggles. And he published several collections of short stories when he was accepted into the University of Iowa Writers Program, known to be the best writing program in the United States. Well, Kinsella hated it. He talked about the loose nature of the program, no deadlines, no serious feedback. One of his teachers kept his manuscript in her drawer the entire semester, and when she returned it to him, there were no marks on it. Bill Kinsella was also no spring chicken when he entered the writers program. He was 43 when he finished at Iowa, and 44 when he wrote the short story that would become the novel Shoeless Joe, that would become the movie Field of Dreams. These are just some of the elements of Kinsella's life. And as he tells it, very few of those events or people made it into his stories. But according to his biographer, Willie Steele,
That's garbage.
if you like the show and crave more content, you can become a Patreon member, where you'll have access to additional audio episodes, video interviews, and other articles and images linked to the show. Go to Patreon/Midnight Library of Baseball. And since this is a one-man production, every bit of support helps. You can donate at midnightlibraryofbaseball.com, and you can add reviews on iTunes and Spotify. Okay, back to the show. As Kinsella tells it, very few of those events or people made it into his stories. But according to his biographer, Willie Steele,
That's garbage. Bill told me and told interviewers for 40 years, I don't write autobiography.
Right.
I'm like, you do. In fact, his best friend, Lee Harwood, and I talked about it. There's a story, a book called Box Socials. And then there's a second book called The Winter Helen Dropped By. And there's a third one that's never been published called The Button Box. But those first two that have been published, there are stories that are exactly what Kinsella said happened in his actual life. He just changed and I'm like, you tell me that you don't write autobiography and then you publish this.
For Shoeless Joe in particular, W.P. Kinsella conducted hands-on research for the novel, and that included his, I don't know how to put this, his actual conducting of the research. It appeared in the novel. For example, W.P. and his wife, Anne, went to Windsor, Vermont and Cornish, New Hampshire, what Kinsella called Salinger country, to get a feel for the area. Then Kinsella went to Boston, went to Cooperstown. He and Anne went to Chisholm, Minnesota, where Doc Graham lived and died. And all of these moments appear in some form in the novel. And as I already discussed with Willie Steele, Kinsella's dislike of his in-laws comes out in Ray Kinsella's description of his holier-than-thou in-laws. Honestly, it's hard to go 10 pages without seeing some kind of overlap between Bill Kinsella, his life, and Shoeless Joe. Maybe it's this denial from Kinsella that creates this blur between fiction and reality for Shoeless Joe and Field of Dreams. Kinsella thinks that he's not incorporating parts of his life, but then unconsciously he absolutely is. And after a while he starts to lose track. This, again, is from the 1995 interview with Kinsella.
Sometimes people will ask me about things in my book, and I can't remember whether they actually happened or whether I made them up.
And there's a great story about this blurring of fiction and reality. When W.P. Kinsella and his wife Anne went to Chisholm, Minnesota, they met and talked with the editor of the local newspaper, Veda Panikvar, about Moonlight Graham. In the novel Shoeless Joe, it's Ray Kinsella and J.D. Salinger who travel to Chisholm and meet with the editor. But a few years later, when a reporter comes to Chisholm to talk with Veda Panikvar, she swears it was W.P. Kinsella and J.D. Salinger who talked with her. And of course, Salinger was a recluse. He never left his town and barely left his home. But that's what she thought happened. Panikvar confused fiction and reality, something that tended to happen in the world of W.P. Kinsella. On the long list of W.P. Kinsella contradictions is the glaring inconsistency between Kinsella's disdain of literary criticism and his self-proclaimed status as a literary writer. In a letter to Lawrence Kessenich, Kinsella doubted his commercial appeal because he thought his writing was too literary. Kinsella loved reading and thinking about prose and the ideas put forth by brilliant authors, but he thought the idea of literary criticism was ridiculous. He couldn't believe any writer would have all of these complex levels woven into their book. He said about literary criticism, quote, "In order to get a degree in English, it was unnecessary to learn a single fact, but only to read and put interpretation on what you had read. The more outlandish, the better." End quote. As fate would have it, the man Kinsella chose to write his biography held a degree in Kinsella's most hated of disciplines. Again, Willie Steele.
Yeah, so when Kinsella reached out to me about doing this biography, I had only met him one time, and it was at a book event. I was living in Portland, Oregon years ago, and I saw he was going to be in town. And so I had written my master's thesis on Field of Dreams and Shoeless Joe and the father-son relationships. And I took it and asked him to sign it. And, I didn't realize how much he hated academia when I did that. And he kind of gave me this look like, looking back, I think he was debating, should I sign this or should I beat this guy over the head with it? And looking back, it could have gone either way.
Mm-hmm.
Thankfully, he signed it. And so he reached out to me after reading my doctoral dissertation was also on Kinsella. I turned that into my first book. And there's a long story, but he ended up reading that book and reached out to me and said, "You didn't screw this up. You don't jump to absurd conclusions like most academics tend to do," which is still my favorite line. I've asked him if I could use that for a blurb on a book, and he said, "Yeah, go ahead." I sat down at his kitchen table with him the first time we met. He picked me up at my hotel. We went and grabbed breakfast, went back to his house, and I said, "This is awkward because first of all, I've never written a biography, so I'm kind of making it up as I go along." I said, "But you hate academia, and I'm an English professor. You hate literary theory, and my degree is actually in literary criticism. So I'm that's 0 for 2. The third strike is that I teach at a Christian college, and you clearly don't have much love for Christianity." And he kind of laughed. He said, "Yeah, I've thought about that. But you seem like you're up to the job."
A lot of people who know Field of Dreams don't know about W.P. Kinsella. And a lot of people who know about Kinsella don't know just how much baseball fiction he's written. Do you think W.P. Kinsella, Bill Kinsella, is like the most prolific literary baseball writer in the United States? I mean, the amount of work that he's done in that area.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. As far as fiction goes, I would say he's certainly there towards the top, if not at the top. I mean, and I certainly have to understand. I have a bias, right? I mean, I wrote the guy's biography. Literally have his boxes of personal diaries in my office. I mean, I've got, yeah. And so I'm probably a little bit slanted towards Bill Kinsella, but
Well, with the evidence, I feel like you can make a pretty good argument.
yeah, I mean, because if you think about it, you've got, Bernard Malamud wrote The Natural. Mark Harris wrote his three baseball books. But as far as just the sheer volume, and they're not all great books. Kinsella himself would say that, like they're not every, to use the baseball language, they're not all home runs. You're going to have some singles, you're going to have, a couple of foul balls, and you may have a couple of strikeouts, but you keep swinging. And what he found out was once he realized that there was a group of people, and it turned into a rather substantial group of people who loved baseball fiction, he was going to keep writing for that audience. And so, yeah, I think when you look at Shoeless Joe, you look at the Iowa Baseball Confederacy. He's got a short story that I just absolutely love, and Phil Robinson, who did the screenwriting and directed Field of Dreams, loves. We've talked about this story. It's called Searching for January. And Roberto Clemente, this guy is out on a beach, walking on a beach one morning on vacation in 1987, and he sees a life raft come up, and Roberto Clemente is on the raft. And Clemente died New Year's Eve of 72. And I'm a Pirates fan. And so that one just hits me, I love that story. And Phil Robinson was talking about seeing Clemente play in New York back in the 60s. And we talked about how beautiful that story is. But it's one that most, unless you're a really diehard Kinsella fan, you probably have never read. And so I think there are some hidden gems like that. But then there are just some really weird, maybe even awful stories. But yeah, I would, now that I think of it, yeah, I would put him towards the top. I think I could make a case that he is, as far as fiction goes, the king of baseball fiction.
But why baseball? After all, Kinsella's first stories and collections were all about the First Nation people in Canada, and he received a lot of success and acclaim from these stories. Well, a large part of the reason was money. Bill Kinsella wanted to make money, and he wanted to do it as a writer. And for anyone, myself included, trying to make money as a writer, it's hard. And Kinsella took advantage of fortuitous turns. As Willie Steele put it,
he saw an opportunity to cash in on baseball, and he did. And a lot of critics were, okay, here's another baseball story. Okay, more fantasy, more father-son issues. And he said, look, people keep buying it. People want this. And so why wouldn't you keep writing these?
Yeah.
I mean, it's, if you pick up a David, I love David Baldacci, kind of airport fiction, fun spy mystery thriller. I know what I'm getting when I buy it. Yeah. And when his new book comes out in a few weeks, I'm going to go to the library, or I'll go to the bookstore and I'll get it because I like it. Yeah. I know what I'm getting when I go get a Snickers bar. I like Snickers, so I think that kind of criticism is sort of unfair.
And another great example of Kinsella's opportunism, and what might be surprising for fans of Field of Dreams, was his opinion on the field in Dyersville, the field left behind after the movie, where people could come for free and take part in this magical story.
People have often asked me, well, what would Bill Kinsella say about the commercialization of it? He would love it. I 100% guarantee he would love it, because Kinsella told me, he goes, I never understood why that family didn't charge $20 a person, because read the end of the book, watch the end of the movie. James Stone says, they'll pay $20 per person. They'll pass it over. Money they have and peace they lack. That's right. And Kinsella's like, why wouldn't you do that?
But when we're answering this question, why baseball, it's not just about money and opportunity. We already heard Kinsella's recounting of his father's stories of Shoeless Joe Jackson, but his father was overall a hockey fan. When Bill was 12, his friend invited him to a baseball game in Edmonton, Canada. This was part of a tiny league of just 4 teams, but Kinsella loved it. He became a lifelong fan. He kept track of major league games and statistics in the United States, and he created his own game of statistics and dice, and followed baseball for the rest of his life. When Kinsella watched that first game, his creative mind was probably seeing the endless possibilities. As Kinsella explained in an interview, baseball is unique among sports.
The foul lines diverge forever, eventually taking in a good part of the universe, and this makes for myth, and it makes for larger-than-life characters. And I think that's why there's been so much good baseball fiction written, and virtually nothing on the other sports because they are twice enclosed, first by time and then by playing boundaries. There's no time limit on a baseball game, but it doesn't matter how wonderful Shaquille O'Neal or Martina Navratilova are, they are trapped on these tiny playing surfaces, and it's very hard to do anything magical with the situations that they're in. Well, it's relatively easy to do magical things with baseball because that fellow did run all the way to New Mexico, and I think someone else got struck by lightning in the outfield and sort of left his imprint on the outfield grass. And I mean, I think that's one of the funniest scenes that I ever wrote.
What I hear when I listen to Bill Kinsella describe baseball is a breeding ground for the strange, the extraordinary, the unexpected, the miraculous. Baseball allows for infinite possibility, but at the same time, it's also a device to tell the human story. As Kinsella explained in a different interview, quote, I write love stories that are peripherally about baseball. I don't write play-by-play. I write about the emotion of people who are often only peripherally involved with the game. End quote. One of the biggest contradictions for Bill Kinsella was his feeling around his most popular novel.
He did tell me, though, with Shoeless Joe, that he wished he had written it later. He felt as though every baseball book that he wrote afterwards, it's no Shoeless Joe.
Ultimately, all of these contradictions led to a life, despite Kinsella's claims to the contrary, that was turbulent, conflicted, and meaningful. And this jousting of various ideas and beliefs led to interesting characters and sometimes brilliantly creative stories. And as his longtime literary agent Carolyn Swayze said of him, quote, he was a dedicated storyteller, performer, curmudgeon, an irascible and difficult man, end quote. For the next generation of writers, Bill Kinsella had a lot of harsh words. But here he wasn't simply being, as Swayze put it, a curmudgeon. Kinsella didn't want to waste his time with people who didn't respect writing or him. But for many others, he was extremely generous with his time and energy. From Lawrence Kesenick.
Bill was a great guy. He always gave me credit, for, saying he said, I would not have gotten started on this book the way I did, without this editor's input.
Phil Alden Robinson, who wrote the adaptation and directed Field of Dreams, had this to say.
What gave me the confidence to keep going, at one point it was Bill Kinsella, because I had written him a long letter explaining all the changes that I felt I had to make. And I was really nervous about it. I really thought, oh, he's going to read this and say some Hollywood jerk is going to ruin my story. And he wrote me back a postcard that said, Dear Phil, do whatever you have to make it a movie. Love, Bill. That postcard sort of changed my life in a way. I mean, it really gave me the courage to just keep going and to not worry about, am I inflicting damage on this beautiful creation of his? And his wife wrote me a letter, Annie wrote me a letter saying, Bill wrote this book to inspire people. He's already written his version. He wants to see how this inspires you to write your version. And I thought, man, these are very unusual people.
And from Willie Steele.
I always tell people, to me personally, Bill Kinsella was nothing but very generous with his time, with his, I mean, he literally gave me 40 years worth of his personal journals. He gave me 500, 600 pages of handwritten autobiographical notes that he had started making back in the 80s. He gave me access to everything that was in the Canadian archives that he had donated over the years. He never once turned down a question. There was nothing I asked him. He said, well, I'm not going to talk about that. And that included awkward conversations about marriages and failed marriages and issues over the years with his kids and reconciliation with the kid. He never once said no. And so for me, he was great. I'm so fortunate to Bill Kinsella because had he not written that book, then Phil Robinson, to whom I also owe a debt of gratitude, and to Larry Kesnick and to Dwyer Brown, it's this sort of progression to where here we are talking today about a book that was written, 40 years ago, 40 plus years ago.
And for Steele, who's read through thousands of pages and hundreds of letters and notes written and filed away by Bill Kinsella, who sat and talked with Kinsella for hours and hours, the journey to Bill Kinsella started for him with his father and baseball. And later, in 1989, it started with the decision to go see a movie about baseball in cornfields, instead of the more popular movie that everyone else was watching.
I went to go see a movie by myself. Everybody else in this group in the summer of 1989 wanted to go see Indiana Jones, whatever, with the Last Crusade. And I wanted to go see this movie. I had saw the trailer about a guy who builds a baseball field in Iowa and a dead ball player comes back. And so I sat there by myself, 16 years old, watching this. And I didn't know, but that literally set me on this path to where I'm at right now. It led to my master's thesis. It led to my doctoral dissertation. It led to the first book. My dad died unexpectedly about 2 months after Kinsella did. And I remember when it took me a long time to watch the movie after Dad died. But I remember when I did, I thought, man, this lump in my throat, how did that get, because I know what's going to happen. But then there's that scene where John Kinsella takes off, Dwyer Brown takes off the mask and turns and goes, it's my father. And I'm like, oh no. I forget who it was said this. I think it was Timothy Busfield, maybe, who played the brother-in-law. That the movie is a dog whistle for men's emotions.
Yeah.
If the movie's on, and I've done this because it drives my wife and kids crazy, I can turn the volume down and I can go word for word and I can give you line by line what the characters are saying. And my kids are like, why do you watch it if you have it memorized? I'm like, well, because I can, one, and two, because it never gets old. And admittedly, I will get choked up at the end every time. It's not because it's not like tears of regret or a lost relationship with my dad. It's the happiness of the memories that I did have with my dad. Going to Pirates baseball games, or when we moved to Ohio, going to Columbus Clippers minor league games or Cincinnati Reds games, Little League, do all of this stuff. But that first time I watched it, I just thought, what a really cool story.
Yeah.
That you can bring somebody on screen, bring somebody back from the dead and let them have a do-over. Because look, Ben, all of us, I've known you for an hour now. All of us have something we would love to have a do-over. To have a chance at having one more conversation with somebody. And I've told people before, my dad and I had a great relationship. It's not like I need to have this, come to, reconciliation with my father or make peace with it. It's none of that. I just miss my dad.
Throughout this journey I'm on, I'm constantly surprised and amazed by how so many people are connected through this project, and in how many different ways they're connected. All of these thick and thin threads, some so thin you have to squint to see them. But then when you do see them, you can follow them for years. And this one last beautiful story from Willie Steele really encapsulates this idea.
His in-laws, including that hypocritical, self-righteous mother-in-law, gave him the baseball encyclopedia, which, if you know, Macmillan, it was called the Big Mac, right? It's this huge book. Everybody who ever played one game in a major league uniform is in that book. And he's leafing through it and he sees the name of Archibald Moonlight Graham. And he thinks, what a great nickname. And he looks, and the guy only appeared in one game and he never got an at bat. Well, you got to track that story down. So he goes to the Baseball Hall of Fame, and Cliff Cackline, who was the librarian at the time, helped him access the files. But then when he and Ann went to Chisholm, Minnesota, which is where he saw Moonlight Graham had died, because the encyclopedia entry has place of birth, place of death, dates, and all this. And so he goes in, and the scene where he and James Earl Jones, Terrence Mann, go into the newspaper office is very similar to what actually happened. Kinsella and his wife went to the newspaper office to see what they could find out about Doc Graham. And the woman, the newspaper editor in the movie reads this beautiful obituary that she had written. That's the actual obituary that was in the newspaper. And Kinsella's talking with her. And Kinsella didn't do most of the interviews. Ann did a lot of the interviews. He and Ann were in there, and they asked the editor, said, do you know if there's a picture of Moonlight Graham that we could use? She reaches up on this filing cabinet and pushes aside this fern, and she pulls down a picture of Moonlight Graham in his New York Giants uniform. And she said, one like this? And he said, yes. Could I make a copy of that? She was friends with Graham and had this picture. Let Kinsella borrow it. Kinsella went down and had copies made. And for years on his desk, there was this little black and white picture of Moonlight Graham that had Chisholm, Minnesota on the little cardboard case that they slid it in. And that's in my office now. It's my very favorite piece of Kinsella memorabilia, because it really, it's this connection to this dead ball player. And I love that. And the fact that when you see the movie, it's like, well, it's just a movie, but that actually happened. The interviews with Moonlight Graham's friends in the bar, those quotes in the novel and in the film were taken from Ann Knight's spiral bound notebook. She would go in and tell me about Moonlight Graham. Well, he always wore an overcoat. He always carried an umbrella. He bought blue hats for his, all of those stories were true. And so, that's with Kinsella, this magical realism, when there's this fantasy and reality that's blended together and you can't separate the two. And I love it.
For the next episode, we'll explore some significant and meaningful differences between the novel Shoeless Joe and the movie Field of Dreams.
I asked him to send me everything he'd written up to that point. And I went through all this stuff. I read every single bit of it, and I ended up right back at Shoeless Joe, Jackson Comes to Iowa. It was so good.
Next time on the Midnight Library of Baseball presents The Making of Field of Dreams. If you think this show's worth $1, please donate at the website midnightlibraryofbaseball.com or through Podbean. You can also leave a rating or review on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast. The show is produced and edited by me, Ben Orlando. Thanks to the Hennepin County Library and their National Authors TV series. Music by Sergei Papkin and Ashot Danielyan. Good night.